Last speaker of the day is Dr. Dan Papero. Dr. Papero is faculty at the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family, where he has been at work since 1975, I think. Dr. Papero is one of the thinkers I consider most scholarly about human history, about science, and about the family. I look forward to his presentation. Thank you.
No. Yes, it is. Yes, it is, you people. Okay. Well, I want to thank Ms. Rauzio and Ms. Harrison for the opportunity to talk. I wasn't scheduled to do this. Unfortunately, Dr. Ann Jones couldn't be here to give her talk, and I was willing to come forward and do it. What you're going to hear today is an abridgment, a major abridgment of an invited talk I gave at the first International Conference on Human Ecology, Human Family Ecology in the Philippines last year in Manila. I apologize to those of you who have had to listen to this and my struggles with it. Several of you here have heard me in various versions of this. So it's not terribly polished, but we'll see what it does. I first of all want to go over some of the major challenges that we face globally. These are big picture things. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, and these things are not mutually exclusive. Each one influences the other in lots and lots of ways. First of all is the growth of global population. We are currently at approximately 7.5 billion souls. That number varies a little bit. We are increasing population at 1.13% per year of the global population, which breaks down to about 85 million per year, or 7 million souls per month. That is the range of the rate of population increase. The United Nations has given 3 estimates as to what the top limit of population increase will be. The first is where we are right now, 7.5 billion. It seems very unlikely that is going to be it. The second is at 11 billion, and the third is at 17 billion. In the 1960s and 70s, Jack Calhoun, whose name has come up many times, predicted that the human population would probably move beyond 9 billion, which he considered a critical number for the maintenance of the quality of life for humans as we know it now. As Dr. Connor pointed out earlier, the question is not feeding the human. That's well within the capacity of our science and agriculture to do this. The problems have to do with the nature of life itself. And even though we can produce great quantities of food, humans run the distribution system, and what we know is in previous famines within recent history, it is the distribution system, the human piece, that's broken down, not the food availability itself. That population is unevenly distributed, both geographically and economically. There's a very uneven age distribution. Approximately 42% of the global population is under the age of 25 and growing. So there is a huge engine of youth driving things currently, and that is only going to increase as this birth rate continues. That is disproportionate. There are more males than females in that cohort. There are about 1.5 billion males in that cohort under 25 compared to about 1.4 billion females. So it's about 100 million difference in males and females. It's a slight difference, but it's an important one. Population migration, of course, is there. Every single one of you who's sitting in this room is sitting here because in your deep history, migration occurred, probably thousands of times. You represent the continuation of a line of survivors who underwent multiple migrations. Migration will be in your future. It's inevitable, and there it is. This gives you some indication of what's changed. These are United Nations figures. In 2000, The number of international migrants was 175 million. As of 2013, it was 232 million and increasing. So we have around 250 million people on the move globally nowadays. You begin to understand why this is becoming a challenge. Migration has always been met with resistance. For those of you who live in Texas, I would point out to you that the state of Texas is based on an aggressive migration that eliminated the Mexican population, essentially, and Mexican control of Texas. I'd also point out to you, all of you good Caucasian Americans, that we essentially annihilated the American Indian with an aggressive migration that was met defensively by the Indian population, and they were destroyed in that. So that we are currently looking at inward migration being met with defensive reaction is not new. And there is reason to fear to some degree, because migrant populations have in fact destroyed indigenous or resident populations. So that the fear, although I consider it unrealistic, is not without some history to it. Again, migration produces social destabilization and the resistance to migratory inflow. Obviously, globalization is here, it's with us. We have an increasingly integrated global economy and a redistribution of industry that Mr. Trump has capitalized upon for a lot of political motivation at the moment. And there's a pressure towards and reaction to cultural homogeneity. Across the world, there is a tremendous pressure to be the same. McDonald's are everywhere in the world. You go. Everybody's wearing Levi's. All the young people are on cell phones. We are an increasingly homogeneous world, and there is a reaction to that. How else do you understand part of the reaction, for example, in the Middle East that plays out as deep religious conservatism, primarily opposed to the increasing homogeneity spreading across the world. Technological advancement rides along with this at an incredible pace, and it is a mixed blessing. It brings with it loss of jobs and advanced educational requirements. The world of the future will go to those who are educated. There's a rapid transmission of information via the internet and the various mobile phone systems across the world. There are pluses and minuses to that, but among the minuses is the transmission of misinformation and the transfer of emotional reactivity. We now can transfer emotional intensity virtually instantaneously across the globe with consequent reactions to that of a global nature. Poverty is with us still. Approximately 12%, almost 13% of the world lives on less than $1.90 a day. Another percentage lives on less than US $3.10 a day. So 28%, approximately, or a bit less than a third of the global population is living at or below $3.10 per day. That doesn't mean that these are necessarily unhappy people. I don't want to ever convey that idea. But it is hard. Life is not necessarily easy for people. Poverty is unevenly distributed globally. The highest rates of poverty are in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. You might note that these are the centers where the bulk of the migratory outflow is occurring, if you take away the conflict-ridden Middle East. Primarily, the migrational forces are moving out of Southeast Asia toward North America and toward Australia, which has led to the Australian problem, which is a significant one. And then sub-Saharan Africa is part of what's flooding Europe right now, and also potentially our borders. And of course, we are having the inflow from South America, which is not part of this particular region. There's an uneven distribution of global resources, which contributes to the problem as well. Obviously, we've talked enough about this today. There is increasing evidence, in spite of some claims that this is a Chinese hoax, for human-driven environmental change. we are seeing increasingly turbulent weather on a global system with gigantic storms increasing in frequency in both hemispheres. Rising sea levels are encroaching upon the global shorelines. Ocean, land, and freshwater pollution and greenhouse gases are part of our daily conversation. Mass extinctions are occurring, linked to all of the above, plus other factors that are still to be discovered, and that may be the greatest problem of all, ultimately, as E.O. Wilson has argued. Illness accompanies us as ever. The four horsemen of the apocalypse ride alongside us as they have always ridden alongside us. They have not gone away. There's a rapid transmission of illness and disease to the global community. That is what's new. We have always had illness with us, but what is different now is the speed by which this can become global, thanks to our transportation systems and this sort of thing. So we have the threat and emergence of regionalized epidemics and global pandemics that so far have not materialized in any way close to the great flu epidemic of 1917-18, but remain out there. There are old and new adversaries in this arena. The old ones are, of course, our familiar old friends: malaria, bubonic plague, cholera, infantile paralysis, measles, and so on and so on and so on. If the news reports are to be believed, we are in the United States on the cusp of a major measles epidemic due to the failure of people to vaccinate their children. But there are new ones as well. Zika, Ebola, West Nile, and some yet to emerge that are part of the world we live in. Children and older people are the most susceptible to these illnesses as they emerge and spread globally. Social unrest marks our world. There's continuous small-scale war and violence across the planet. I would underline small scale, but it is continuous. Many have made the point that part of the United States dilemma is that we have been on a wartime footing for over 50 years, which is true, if you think about it. We have become a warrior nation, and we are showing the effects of that. Governmental instability accompanies this. Gosh, if anybody isn't aware of governmental instability now, they should go back to bed and hope for another new day. Polarization among social and religious groupings is a marker of our world, and as a result, there are efforts to force one group's view on another, and that becomes the basis for a lot of the disagreement. There's broad usage of anxiety and stress-reducing mechanisms in the world, which leads to the development and expansion of illegal activities, coercion, and human exploitation, which are reflected in these various sorts of activities, which appear to be increasing on a global level. Particularly of interest is the human trafficking and exploitation of children, which is the great, apparently, undercurrent of this phenomenon at a global level. Social inequality is always a factor, but we've known ever since the Whitehall studies of the 1970s, or later than that, Whitehall 1 and Whitehall 2, the growing in the Western world discrepancy and steepness of the curve between those who are most highly positioned within the social framework and those that are lowest, and the consequences for health and other things that emerge from that increasingly steep gradient between those that have and those that don't. The preferred positions bring with it lots of advantages. All of these things are documentable. Less desirable social positions bring all of these things. And the middle range is falling out, which is what Calhoun showed with his mice populations in his research in the 1960s. And then broad demography, which Dr. Connor has alluded to, include two major things that are going on, which is the shrinking and disappearance of the extended family, due primarily to a decrease in global fertility. The number of children per woman on a global level has decreased by about 50% in the last 25 years. It's now, I think, at a global level about 2.5 children per female. Obviously that is skewed by regional distribution, but that is down from about 5 per female about 35 years ago. And of course the one-child policies have also influenced this. And we are seeing the disappearance of the extended family. Whether that's a major problem or not remains to be seen. There's also the decline of male supremacy, speaking as a wounded male. This is self-evident. There are surging, literally surging rates of women in educational programs globally. And there are legions of women now who are in the corporate and management ranks at lower levels. It is just a matter, I agree with Dr. Connor on this, it is just a matter of time before these folks are going to surge through and begin to run the show in lots of ways. Boys are struggling. They're struggling in education, they're struggling in careers. We know this, they're vulnerable to lots of stuff. So there we go. So those are the broad demographic things. Dr. Bowen focused attention on the family unit, and I want to emphasize this. It is the unit that I want to talk about in terms of adaptation, not an individual's adaptation, although an individual's adaptation contributes to the adaptation of the unit. And I actually believe that all adaptation is local, essentially. The unit is adapting to the conditions it faces. And they may be one set of conditions here in Navasota, Texas, another set of conditions in Ciudad Juarez, which has been the seat of Ms. Rauzio's efforts over the years, or in Los Baños in the Philippines, or Hong Kong, or wherever it may be. All adaptation is local. Does a family relationship stress response exist? I'm going to argue that it does. There is increasing research to support this. Many of you may be familiar with the work of the sociologist Reuben Hill and his 1949 publication called Families Under Stress, in which he was looking at a group of families carefully selected in Iowa, over 200 families, and he was looking at the effects of the challenges brought about by World War II on these families where fathers were in the service and some were killed and so on, and looking at the response patterns of these families to this sort of challenge. That work has continued. In 1983, McGubbin and Patterson produced a review of Hill's work that led to increasing support for his view, and more recently, Figley and Kaiser, in their view of traumatized families, has also looked at the family unit response to adversity, to challenge. These are not Bowen theory people. They are not, and they miss a number of the important aspects that Bowen looks at. But there is a reasonable academic lineage for looking at it this way. I would argue that they do, and that physiological stress can be expanded to the idea of the unit. I rely on that to my colleague Victoria Harrison, whose work has convinced me that this thing is going up and down together. It's not happening individual by individual. It is the unit that is pulsing with this sort of thing. It's probably reflected more broadly in what could be called emotional tension in relationships and in the pattern of reactivity connected to that emotional tension. I picked that word tension particularly, first of all, because Dr. Bowen uses it in conjunction with the concept of chronic anxiety. For those of you who want to follow it up, go look at his writings about this. And secondly, Hill and some of these other family researchers suggest that one of the major markers of a less than satisfactory adaptation when a family faces challenge is a shift in the degree of emotional tension within the relationships in the family that moves from a lower level to a higher level and does not go back to that lower level. Is there a psychological stress response that is larger than the individual? And this is self-evident. I would argue indeed that it is. It's reflected in broad background states of optimism and pessimism and shared perceptual and interpretive frameworks that mark a family unit. They mark also other social units. This is what Bowen referred to as the family emotional oneness, this broad psychological framework by which and through which information is strained, interpreted, and decisions are acted upon. And it is in conjunction with that psychological emotional oneness, the concept of differentiation actually takes on significant meaning. The human family is a biological unit fundamentally, in my view. It has reproductive functions linked to the evolution of mammals and parent-offspring relationships. I've been deeply influenced by Paul MacLean, along with Jack Calhoun. The context for infant development requires a family. As Hillary Clinton was famous for saying, it takes a village, and it indeed does. But there are also, in addition to reproductive functions, somatic functions that are linked to the need to extract resources from an environment and from changing environments. And the family unit provides for the possibility for greater efficiency in resource extraction from a given environment. And this may be one of the more important things for a human family. It allows for expanded information gathering and analysis. A working family unit has a bigger brain than any single human individual. It has the linked processing of multiple brains, much like the harvester ants that Leanne talked about, where each individual is responding out of his or her own self, but is part of a processing system that is affecting the entire unit. And when you link the human family up and those brains, you have a tremendously expanded processing unit to both pull in information about the environment and to analyze and respond to it. And of course, it's self-evident that the human family also performs defensive and protective functions toward competing groups. Families differ from one another in how they respond to stress and challenge. They start at different points. Some families are quite competent right at the beginning, and others are less competent. Talk a bit about what competency looks like if you want at some point. Competency is influenced by, number one, the family history. What the family has done historically. There is evidence for this. This is not my opinion. The maturity of the family members, which is another way of talking about differentiation of self, but it incorporates within it two fundamental ideas from my point of view. One is the responsibility for self, an awareness of the need to be responsible for oneself and one's life, and a developed concept of responsibility to others. And the two are inseparable in my view. The quality of leadership available in that family unit, which is another variable in it, but it's also influenced by the severity of the challenge faced. There are less severe and more severe challenges, but another variable in this has to do with how the family is defining and perceiving the challenge. There are families who face what I might consider a major challenge who do not see it that way. Their perceptual framework does not interpret it that way, and they do very well with it. There are other families who deal with something that I would see as a minor threat, who deal with it very poorly. They interpret it through this psychological family framework as a major threat and do poorly with it. And some families are more chronically stressed than others. There is evidence for this as well, for the existence of chronically anxious families. There are a number of sources to look at in beginning to pull this together. Nobody uses the term chronically stressed or chronically anxious families, but terms like risky families are used and things like that. And if you look at the literature, they are describing families that are marked by ineffective and inefficient adaptive processes as they address challenge. So families appear to vary in their efficiency and effectiveness as they adapt to change. And this is again well documented. Some families are functioning pretty darn well prior to the challenge. They do really well with the challenge, and they sail right out the other side with almost no glitch in them at all. This is a small percentage of families. The great bulk of families sort of live in a middle ground, where they are sort of doing okay before things happen, The challenge happens, they sort of muddle through, they may have a drop in their effectiveness and efficiency of response. As they come out the other side, they sort of bump up again. This is where most of us live. It's certainly where I live. And then there's a group that are functioning relatively poorly prior to challenge. They function very poorly through the challenge, and they either decline in functioning after the challenge or maintain that same level of poor functioning that they showed before. These families typically fragment under those sorts of pressures, and the emergence of very serious individual impairment and impairment of relationship structures accompany those things. So, it's all, I just said what's on the slides. I'm sorry, got ahead of myself. How do you think about efficiency and effectiveness of a family? This is a slide that's trying to summarize many, many things that I have many, many slides describing in my longer talks, so hopefully this will convey something about it. One of the things one looks at has to do with shifts in the emotional tension level in the family over time. How has the family gone through the challenge and what's happened to the level of emotional tension in the family? People can tell you about this. You can also measure it in certain sorts of ways. The degree of impairment that emerges and is maintained during and post-challenge. In other words, are individuals impaired by this? Is the family's developmental trajectory impaired by this? These are clear markers when you begin to look at families as they go through these things. Again, individual impairment, impairment of the processes themselves within the family, how the family is responding to challenge. You can outline what those are. I've done that in other talks. But one of the biggest markers of an impairment of processes is a decrease in the flexibility of the family to adapt to shifting functions of family members. The family becomes rigid, if you will. And that rigidity is a problem for the future. There's a decline in contact among family members. There's a degree of loss and or failure of the family to restore resources used in the response to the challenge, so that the family does not restore its pre-existing resource capacity to respond. And again, there are lots of things that go into the resource bag of a family that could be talked about. And the degree of disruption of child developmental and family developmental trajectories is an important thing that is a consequence or can be tracked through family responses to challenge. We tend to think of a challenge being a single thing. In fact, as many have pointed out, there is the response, and then there are the follow-through problems that emerge from the original response, so that the response to a challenge is actually a cascade of responses that go on over time, and I'm just about out of time. This is points others have made. The family organism is virtually immortal. All family units, other social units come and go, but the mechanism of family emotional process carries the family response in the future. Each response is retained in the system. Each response can be more or less efficient and effective. The response patterns are from chaos to competence. I won't read all of these. They can be intensely emotionally reactive to thoughtful and well-regulated interaction. They can range from the absence of leadership to the presence of engaged and effective leadership. It can be from passive endurance and helplessness to active engagement in problem solving. These represent ends of continua from which you can look at a family and make some thoughts about it. At the heart of the family response lies differentiation of self. This influences how the family perceives the event itself, influences the number of options perceived, the collective degree of differentiation of undifferentiation, which is in the family, or this is the level of maturity of the family, which includes costs that are carried through from previous responses plus benefits, the degree of stress in the current challenge, the number and intensity of stressors, and I'm going through this pretty quickly. I want to come back to Calhoun's eye of the needle, his term. As Dr. Connor pointed out early, somewhere in the middle of this century, probably somewhere after the middle, we're going to go through the eye of the needle, as Calhoun called it. That eye of the needle is shaped by increasing human population density, plus environmental change, plus the tendency for anxious human reactivity that can block or eliminate careful and coordinated responses. Beyond the eye of the needle, again, we get into how families navigate that. It will be critical to the social structures and processes that develop in the near and distant future. As with all challenge, some families will not make it, and that is a unfortunate fact. But some will, and some will create new solutions to old and new problems. And let me finish. Calhoun suggested that of those that survive evolutionary challenge, it is, as he calls it, the weak. The weak survive. They are the ones that are forced to migrate. They are the ones that move into the new niches and create the new species of the future. Humans and families will be faced to forge new responses on the anvil of old problems, to migrate intellectually, which includes from locked to open perceptual frameworks, from linear causality to complex living systems, from program responses to adaptive experiments, to migrate emotionally, from poorly regulated reactivity to well-regulated integration between emotion and cognitive aspects, and to migrate behaviorally, from polarization to coordination, from withdrawal to engagement, and from chaotic response to coordinated interaction. I think that's the end of it. Thank you. 30 minutes, perfect.
Thank you all for the thinking stirred. Would you start with comments?
I do want to say that Louise Razio is one of the most remarkable people I have known who practices what she preaches. It has been a stunning thing for me to watch Louise over the years, first beginning with Native American populations and then moving to El Paso. I was fortunate to be invited several times to El Paso to participate in the efforts around particularly the violence at the border, but other sorts of things. It was both a moving and very enlightening experience for me and a very humbling experience. You begin, when you live in the world of ideas like I do, you think you know the answers to things, and then you get down there and you're faced with the reality of things, and it ain't quite so simple. So I very much appreciate it. But Louise has walked the walk, and I deeply admire that. That's all I'm going to say about that.
This process of continuing to take on challenges and all could not happen to with an individual. I've had an amazing experience of people through the Bowen Center, and not just at the Bowen Center, but through the work there, and a family that has been amazing considering what they've had to go through with me here and there and everywhere. But this is an experience of community, I think, in learning what's possible in connections with others who are thinking and putting their practice to work. I'll see if anything more. I'm still amazed that I'm here, and will be even more amazed when I get back to Houston through the traffic. But it has been just these 2 days. I am so grateful that I was able to do this. I had my questions, and boy, is it good to be here.
Well, my position on this kind of situation is that nobody fills the shoes you would vacate. I am very glad you're here too. Nobody could. Dr. Connor, thoughts stirred for you, questions by these presentations?
So this is, you both talked about migration, but what you said then was we're all descended from people who migrated many times, and I want to ask Louise about the more conventional sense of migration of the last few centuries, let's say, it has always seemed to me that, with a few exceptions, namely the descendants of slaves, Native Americans, and the descendants of Mexican Americans who were here when we stole Texas and the rest of the Southwest. Everyone who's here is descended from, is descended from someone who is self-selected to come here. And the implications of that seem profound to me. People always talk about American exceptionalism and what accounts for it, and they talk about the frontier mentality, which I'm sure is very important here in Texas and west of here. But the people who are self-selected to come here and their descendants, they can't be a random sample of their home countries, and they have to be behaviorally and psychologically. I don't know. You fill in the blank, but something that got them here.
Different.
Yeah.
They are different from the ones
the people
that
who
stayed home.
stayed. Yeah. And I wonder what you think about that idea, whether you think it's important.
I am not absolutely sure that everybody was brought here, except, that the people who were brought here were the slaves and a few others. I think there are so many forces that impel people, not just their clarity of purpose. They're coming for many, many reasons. But I have wondered and been trying to get some answers to the question about what would those differences look like if I could do a scientific study of just even a small sample of those who came. And I play around with these silly things like, my husband's from an Italian family that emigrated. And I know all of the people there. He is the only one in his cousins, aunts, uncles, who left Boston after they settled there. Now, what does that say? I don't know. He's a part of a migrating impetus somehow. But there's others in the family are not. I don't know. It's fascinating, but worth a study. But it's not going to be mine. Thank you.
The migration reasons are just so interesting and varied that I am descended on one side of my family from the Mayflower and from early settlers of New Amsterdam, Long Island. They are there primarily because they couldn't get along with anybody else. They were religious dissidents. So on the one hand, we have a tradition of people settling this country who couldn't get along in the countries from which they came. The southern part of the United States was populated initially by prisoners who were being shipped out of Britain. One of the reasons Australia was colonized was because the American Revolution happened and the British couldn't send their prisoners here anymore. It's now become a matter of pride to be descended from the First Fleet in Australia, but these were convicts. Now, convicts meant they were debtors primarily. They weren't necessarily awful people. But we often have, the migrants are often the people who can't get along or who are in trouble in one way or another in their home countries. On the other side of my family, I'm a first-generation American of Italian descent. My grandfather left Italy because he managed to get himself in major trouble and ran for his freaking life, which is not a very orderly progression. He left behind his wife and 2 small children for over 2 years to fend for herself before he scraped together, or she scraped together, the money to come to the U.S., whereupon he had 4 more children, only to have his wife, my grandmother, die in the swine flu epidemic of 1918 when my father was 6 years old. He then put his children, the 2 boys, young boys, my father and his brother, in a Catholic orphanage in western New York, which to his dying day my father hated with a passion that you can't believe. He put the 1 daughter in the family in the care of family friends, left the 3 older boys, the oldest of whom was 14, on their own, and he went back to Italy and got a new wife and was gone 2 years, whereupon the oldest brother in the family, my Uncle Nick, who by that time was 17, having married a 13-year-old, brought the family together again, got the kids out of the orphanage, pulled the daughter in, and set up a harsh family. But by God, he saved it. And it wasn't everybody loves everybody. It was hard, harsh. My Uncle Nick ruled with his fists. But the family survived. And I have both of those in me, and that's all part of the migration story. Why do people come? Bobby Lowe, whom used to be the chair of the Department of Ecology at Michigan, studied Swedish records about who migrated from Sweden in the 1700s. And it turned out that the migrants were primarily males who, because of the primogeniture law rules in Sweden, could not inherit land. So they moved. And the females tended to stay in place if they could marry someone who inherited land, but not if they didn't. So we have these studies of conditions that lead to
That would be, oh yeah.
it is the ones, I think Calhoun was right, it is in a sense the weak who move, those who do not have established positions in one way or another. I don't know, I get carried away on that stuff. Let me shut up.
I must put 2 cents worth in while people make their way.
Well, I want to draw something that I learned from I think it's important that I learned from one of my students. She was doing a presentation on her own situation, basically as the child of immigrants, and she drew these 2 circles, which were a picture of her struggle between her Latina identity that she had at home, very strong Latina identity, and her new American identity, let's call it. She said, I'm here. And as a teenager, it was a big struggle for me to put these 2 things together. And it's like a bolt of lightning hit me, and I said, Daniela, you are the American story. This is the American story. You have some culture coming in with the immigrants, and their children are the ones who, as they grow up, and probably especially in adolescence, forge those 2 things together to create what is really a new kind of American identity every time, I think. So I sorry for that, but I love learning from my students, and that's one of the coolest things. I remember learning from one.
One of the thoughts this last panel stirred for me was is this, that I would hypothesize that everyone in this room today who represents a survivor of a family who could survive and reproduce, who are descendants of a family who could survive and reproduce, that we represent people who have been through, whose ancestors have been through the eyes of needles. And the basis for that is most striking in my own history is a branch of my family that the women from Sweden who are here today located for me in Gunnerskog, Sweden, in the Värmland province, and took me to visit, where I met the village historian who gave me the records of my family. And I found that I was descended from a couple who were less than sharecroppers. They really were probably homeless and on the street when they came to the attention of the government and the church when Britta was arrested for theft and for fighting in public with her husband. They were jailed and then released to a family who gave them land in exchange for probably food. And they had 5 children. My great-great-great-grandfather was the youngest of those 5, and he left at 14 and moved to Norway, where he married and then came into Central Texas. And one of my cousins gave me Andrew Moberg's Prehistory of the Swedish People, 2 tiny volumes. He's the man more well known for writing The Immigrants. And his compilation of the history of Sweden from almost the point where man emerged from either bonobo or chimp. It's a deep history. And in that he describes the Black Plague. He describes when the plague swept Sweden and the number of villages destroyed, the few people who survived. Chances are my ancestors were among the survivors of that eye, of that needle. So I find that to be difficult to read because, as some people here may know, the plague not only killed people but produced the social responses to the reality of death and the reality of pervasive death. And Moberg describes and compiles the history of what happened during those times when people began to kill people before the plague did. And there was devastation throughout that rural country. And I have no reason to doubt that the Nielsen's, who were poverty-stricken in Gunnerskog, nonetheless survived the eye of that needle, which is very remarkable. And I suspect every family in this room has a survival story if we but knew it. I find that somewhat hopeful when I look at the challenges that we face in these days. And I think I'll be eternally thankful to the students of Bowen Theory in Sweden who let me have access to those stories, that history. Yeah. Comments, thoughts, questions?
Sally Eisen Miller, and the Eisen looking at both sides of the family. My dad was a Holocaust survivor, and he on that side is the only survivor. So there's cut off on one side and then over-involvement on the other. Before coming to this conference, I found a book that I think is very interesting, and I think it relates to these 2 days. It's called The Journey of Man, A Genetic Odyssey, written by Spencer Wells. And there's a quote in here that actually isn't his, but I thought was interesting, by Bertolt Brecht, who wrote The Life of Galileo. And he says, "The aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error." I thought that was interesting. But what I wanted to say about this book, and maybe some of you have read it and maybe some of you on the panel can comment, it says, around 60,000 years ago, a man identical to us all in important aspects lived in Africa. And every single person, which means all of us in this room, alive today is descended from him. And then he goes on to talk about that in this new science, in this book, it's replete and astonishing information that tells us the story. It's a sort of the story of, in quotes, the real Adam and Eve that came first by some 80,000 years. and talks about how every single human being, starting back in Africa, that we all are related. And so this book notes that in his research, scientific research in this book. So I recommend it.
Any comments from
What
the
if you
panel?
don't like your relatives?
What I was really, I mean, this was just such an excellent panel. Thank you. What I was really interested in and thinking about was not the people who migrate, but the people to whom they are migrating and the reactivity that goes on. And I just spent a long time reading 1471, I guess. And one of the things it describes is really the migration of the Spanish to the Americas, and also then the migration of the Pilgrims and the other early settlers, and the impact of that on the civilizations that existed at that time. And so the reactivity of those civilizations, I was thinking there's a parallel in some ways to the reactivity of the civilizations to whom the migrants are coming today. I mean, they're not killing all of us like we did to the Native Americans and the Spanish did to the South Americans. But the level of reactivity, I mean, there really weren't any open spaces as I understand it, in the 1400s. I mean, people lived everywhere. So there was this conflict that went on. And I was thinking that there's some similarity to what's going on today, in terms of a pushback. But I didn't know if you had
I
any
wondered
comment.
if you have any thoughts, and especially these two who've been thinking about migration some. Are we doing better? Are we doing better with it today than they did then? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, the people that are migrating into our country aren't, I mean, there's a reactivity to it, but they're not killing us. The way
That's a big difference.
that would be different. The other thing I was thinking about, and this really relates to things Pat Camella brought up, is, I was thinking that if you think about that there's these migrants coming to these countries that then are resisting. That's one way of thinking about it. I was thinking, like, for instance, migrants coming to Hungary and Hungary putting up a wall, or are putting up a wall. But there's also the triangles that are at work. I was thinking that in some ways that the war in Syria has some sort of triangles with the fact that the U.S. and Russia can't come to some sort of agreement. That there's all kinds of other players, and then the migration is kind of a reflection of that emotional process where two or a number can't agree over here. There's sustained conflict, and then that comes out on these other countries that then get all reactive. So anyway, those are just the thoughts that, there's the migrants and there's the civilizations to which they migrate, and that's an interesting counterpart.
While you're talking, I remember that in the early to mid 1800s there were American hotels that had signs that said no Irish or dogs allowed. And then a few decades later there were signs that said no Jews or dogs allowed. And I don't know how many times that was repeated. I know that those two cases are true, but every wave of immigrants that has come to the United States has been targeted by people who could not have been more than one or two generations removed from immigration themselves. And it seems like people want to pull the ladder up behind them when they finally get in here. And so that's and I think we're seeing some of that now. I mean, you have it always seems to me we all have so much to identify with in the next wave of immigrants because we all came from there, and yet some of us don't identify identify. Some of us just, say, I'm an American, keep out. And it's not a flattering aspect of human nature or American nature.
It's important to keep in mind that exactly 100 years ago this year we passed the Immigration Act of 1917, which essentially blocked migration from Asia. The great fear was the Chinese, the yellow peril, as it was referred to in those days. And we significantly blocked immigration. It still continued, but this is nothing new that's going on, and we will have an immigration ban of some sort. It seems very likely that will probably be targeted in a different direction, but will be essentially the same process, but it's exactly 100 years ago. And pursuant to what Dr. Connor said, one of the largest lynchings in the United States occurred in New Orleans in the 1890s, and it wasn't African Americans, it was Italian Americans who were lynched. Italian Americans were not considered Caucasian.
Here's a question. In light of that aspect of migration in human history, what would be examples of the better angels of our nature in terms of receiving and responding to immigration? What examples might the panel have, or someone?
So we are that example too. We did it in the end. We've done it. We've done backsliding. We've opened the doors. We've closed them. We've opened them. We've closed them. But we're a nation of immigrants, so we're a success story. Right now, Canada looks much better than we do in terms of receiving immigrants openly and treating them well, and even Europe, Western Europe, but we have done it more than almost any other country in the world. I mean, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are countries of immigrants, but we're the ones who accepted by far the largest number over the centuries.
Yeah, I agree. I think the United States is one of the great multicultural success stories in spite of our bad press. And I think, the Canadians tend to pride themselves on it, but I think the United States has actually done better in terms of the huge numbers that have been integrated, and each succeeding wave within 30 or 40 years becomes part of the mainstream, and that will continue. Immigration is the lifeblood of this country, and when you cut it off, you cut the major artery of our society in many ways. And it is, you'll get my own personal political views, it is a backward, short-sighted, illiterate and ignorant response to a global phenomenon that does need to be addressed. I think we probably, it's part of the not addressing things that then we get these huge problems that emerge. But immigration has been forever the lifeblood of this country and of many countries in the world. I think it's true of Australia too, about which I know something, not a great deal, but and many countries.
Well, thank you for those examples, and I think they will be the closing remarks for the panel. Thank you all for presenting and discussing this afternoon.
My expectations of the day have gone exactly and more what I had hoped for this day to be. So I don't have much more to say on that. It's the speakers, the people who are here, who are engaged. I can't ask for a better day. So now I hear from people telling me, how did you get somebody like Dr. Connor? Well, how? We asked him, among other things, how did you get people whose thinking fit this whole thing? Asked, and they said yes. And then I just said, oh my gosh, what a nice thing this is. I'm going to go to enjoy it. So anyway, if you have a comment I'd love to hear it, but I just don't have a lot more to add to this, Dave. What can I add?
Thank you for pulling it together.
Okay.